Eh bien, bonjour tout le monde. Je suis McGill Centre, le directeur du Centre de recherche interuniversitaire sur les humanités numériques à l'Université de Montréal, en association avec nos collègues de McGill et Concordia. Et c'est avec beaucoup de plaisir que je vous accueille tous aujourd'hui en direct et en ligne pour recevoir mon ami et collègue Stéfan Sinclair de McGill University, qui, dans le monde des humanités numériques, n'a évidemment pas besoin d'introduction, surtout si vous voyez le petit hibou qui a changé nos vies il y a maintenant longtemps, voilà, on va dire longtemps. Donc, merci de ce jour à moi pour accueillir Stéphane aujourd'hui pour nous parler de DreamScape, un nouveau projet lié à Voyant.
Merci, Mickaël. Merci d'être venu. Comme les annonceurs de OK, je vais me prononcer en anglais parce que quand on en parlait, en fait, c'est mon collègue Andrew Piper qui était censé faire la présentation. Je n'étais pas le premier choix, je signale. So I'm going to speak in English for the discussion afterwards, or if I lapse into French at some point, we can sort of go back and forth. So I want to talk today about DreamScape. I want to emphasize that in my mind, this is very much a work in progress. I'm not coming here to present a finished project, and so as a result, I'm hoping to get from you as much as possibly you'll get from me. I don't have any claims that what we're doing is anything as significant as the Eiffel Tower. So of course, the Eiffel Tower was originally not supposed to, as you all know, last as long as it did, and so yeah, maybe Voyant and DreamScape have some future. I actually didn't intend to, but for various reasons, I went back and looked at slides that I presented here either a year ago or 2 years ago on a presentation called Reanimating the Corpus. And at that time, we were just starting out with the DREAM project. And so I won't do the whole background on DREAM, but it's a part of a short partnership project that involves various colleagues. And it's really around distant reading methods that, as I would have called it then. For various reasons, I would probably use a different term now, but distant reading on early modernity. So on a very large scale corpus of early modern texts. And I looked in particular at my last slide, and my last slide said this. So this is like the next step slides, which I don't know about you, but usually for me, it's a work of a bit, aspirational fiction or something like that, where I'm sort of hand waving at some of the directions that we might go, but I never really take it very seriously. But I was surprised to see this, that we had discussed, 2 years ago, I'd said that we would look at doing a non-consumptive view of EBO phases 1 and 2. So I don't know if everyone's familiar with the term non-consumptive, but it's the idea that you can do a certain amount of text analysis without necessarily having full access to the full text. You can do some interesting things. And because of the way TCP EBO is structured, they release blocks in phases where partner libraries who have paid a certain amount of money have access to the current phase, and then the rest of it becomes available 5 years in the future, whatever the case may be. So we're in the period where phase 1 is public, anyone can have access. Phase 2 is still within the partnership. And so the interface, the text analysis interface that we were imagining had to confront this challenge that some of the text could be made freely available, others had to be firewalled or had to be constrained to a certain extent. As it happens, we actually checked that. We did some work on interfaces for non-consumptive views of EBO 2, really. We also did a more generic catalog browser in Voyant. So part of the idea, this is what I presented last time, that Dream, the interface, was meant as a way of subsetting a very large corpus. TCP EBO 1 and 2 has about 45,000 texts. It would be unusual for anyone to want all 45,000 texts at once. There are questions that you might want to ask, but typically you either want to constrain it, filter it by period, by author, by genre, by some metadata fields of some kind. And part of the point that I was making then was that there's a gap between the tools that we have that are database repository-like tools and the tools that are more oriented around doing text mining. And DREAM was meant as sort of a bridge between those two. And we did create a more generic catalog browser in Voyant. The third one was to create large-scale visualizations in the conversion lab. And this is what sort of struck me because, in fact, DreamScape is the thing that I'm going to be presenting on today, is the manifestation of this third point, that we're trying to imagine what you would do if you have large data walls. So this data wall happens to be showing Voyant. It's not our data wall, but our data wall is fairly similar. We have this infrastructure that cost a fortune. And now, for my own conscience and sleeping, we're trying to figure out ways that we can justify that purchase. Or how, a better way of saying it is, how can we make full use of large scale, high resolution, in some cases interactive visualizations using some of the large collections we have. So that's the general concept. DREAM was the original project, the interface in Voyant to go from TCP EBO to Voyant. DreamScape is, in a sense, a continuation of that with a mapping component. It may be worth saying, well, actually, I think I've already said most of the important things. So TCP EBO is a collection of, currently phases 1 and 2 have about 45,000 texts. The entire project, which is meant to encompass texts from 1474 to 1700 of various genres, has 125,000 texts. So this is a longer term project, and the TCP EBO partnership is a longer term project to make these texts available. And as I said, the current phases is phase 1 and 2. This, if just a reminder, is what the interface somewhat looks like for DREAM. And so it's a web page. The idea is that you have access. In this case, I have phase 1 because this is a public facing one where I can see the full text. And you can do faceted searches on either the full text or metadata fields constrained by date and so on. So one of my students, for instance, was interested in the London fire, and so constrain the text to a certain period with text that mention fire in some ways. You create a subset that's sort of a virtual subset, and then two functionalities. One is you can either download, so we're not pretentious enough to think that everyone wants to use Voyant all the time. If you don't want to use Voyant, you want to use it in Python or something else, you can download that archive, or you can launch a new corpus. But the advantage is the corpus that's here is already Voyant corpus, and so it's very fast, relatively speaking, to create a subset of that, because in fact it's sort of a virtual view of a subset of the corpus. Okay, so that's the basic idea of DREAM. What we were imagining, again, was what kind of interface, what kind of tool could we think of that would make use of our data walls and start to explore some of the possibilities of doing geospatial, so that led us down the path of thinking about doing some kind of mapping interface, because at the moment, Voyant doesn't have any mapping tools. This is so I'll just read it. Geography, location, and place have traditionally been understudied by the humanities. This is not because of a lack of interest in them or because of a failure to acknowledge their importance, but instead because these are difficult concepts to handle effectively. So this is saying a lot. To unpack it a bit, I mean, I think it's fairly self-explanatory, but the basic idea is that we're humanists. We're very interested in people, locations, time, dates, that sort of thing, but we don't tend to incorporate that into methodologies, at least not with computer-assisted methodologies. there's a bit of it that happens, but really surprisingly, not that much, right? And it's in part because, not because we don't recognize that it's important, it's because it's very tricky. It's tricky conceptually to think about spaces and places and locations, especially maybe in a literary context where you might be combining the place names that change over time, place names that are fictitious, place names that are co-referential or intertextual, or all kinds of gnarly things that make it part of fiction that mean that even conceptually it's hard to grapple with. But in addition, it requires a knowledge of language that's sort of beyond what current computing is capable of doing. So it's not the case that a computer can reliably parse a text and find all of the locations, in part because what we mean by locations might be variable even for different applications, and in part because there's a lot of ambiguity in language in terms of what things are referring to. Sometimes places can refer to people and so on. I'll give a certain number of examples of this. So it's not that we're saying that, you know, we're tackling large-scale geospatial humanities for the first time. In fact, there's a great collection of articles called Literature and Cartography that assembles. This is from, I'm going to say 2014, something like that. It's an edited collection of people grappling with how to study literature using cartography and generally using computational methods. One of the things that we were interested in, so, you know, obviously we can do all kinds of things conceptually when it comes to mapping. The typical use of mapping is something that happens more in social sciences, where you have things like, you have a map and you have data, essentially tabular data, that's mapped onto a map, right? So an example would be, show me a map of England with the density of different churches by region, right? So you have a separate table where all of that is being represented, visualized on a map. And that can be interesting, but a lot of those kinds of things, when you're relying on tabular data, it tends to start looking more social sciencey. It tends to start looking less like interpretation of text as we do in literature. And I recognize that not all of you are in literature, but this is sort of the orientation for this. It's less about interpretation and close reading of text and more about sort of literary history at best, or sort of as a form of social science history. And you know, I'm certainly not wanting to dismiss that kind of research, but it's not the thing that we were primarily interested in. What we wanted to do was to see what we could do if we identify locations in text, then what? So, you know, one of the things that comes to mind is you could include the locations as one of the things that you could search on in the Dream interface that I showed. But we wanted to be a little more crazy, ambitious than that. And I say it that way for reasons that'll become clear. We wanted to see if there were any other ways in which we could use this massive data. And we started to think about sort of a syntax of sequences of locations in text. That is, if you have two locations that follow each other in the text, what does that mean? In some cases, it could mean that someone is traveling from place A to place B, right? In some cases, it could mean that someone is in place A and just so happens to mention someone in place B, right? And those are two examples among an infinite number of examples that I could give. But the idea is, what does that represent for someone who's reading the text and for who's trying to understand the text? Is there that much difference in those two scenarios if the reader is conceptually jumping from location A to B, even if all of the characters aren't moving, or even if the action, as it were, isn't moving, there's still a displacement, there's still a movement that's conceptual that might be interesting to think about. And of course, we're not the first to wonder about journeys and travel and location and visualizing this. So this is a map from Barbara Piatti, who has an article in that collection that I mentioned, and this probably isn't very visible, but I just want to give it as a quick example of someone who was trying to show journeys from various places. In this case, also color coding by sort of, what might be called more humanistic dimensions. So in this case, it's, does the narrator talk in the past, the present, or the future? That's what's going to determine the coloring. And that's sort of another signal that we have in reading this map, right? One of the characteristics of a map like this, of course, is that it's static. You have to read, everything is there, and you're reading it as is one block, right? And so one of the things that we wanted to experiment with was trying to find ways of showing interactive data, right? Which means that any screenshot that I show isn't really going to do justice to what we're trying to do, because it's sort of about the interactivity of it. I want to mention this. So if you ignore the rest, there's this tweet saying there's this talk today here. And then I sort of boosted the signal a bit to say that this is the world premiere of DreamScape, which is true. This hasn't been shown anywhere else except in the offices of CRIHN, which we'll talk about in a moment. And then what was interesting is that one of the answers that was given was, my dream tool is NLP-NER GeoViz with an early modern gazetteer behind it. Text with sequential place names and stories turns into map journeys with one click. Exists? I mean, this I found unbelievable, because it's precisely what we're trying to do. So either we're not actually being as imaginative and original and creative as we think, or this is actually fulfilling potentially a real need that people have of trying to imagine what happens if you start to read the sequentiality, the n-grams of locations of place names in text. Barbara Piatti says this: combining hermeneutic approaches with methods of distant reading. Actually, that's a title, so that's why it's not a complete sentence. As far as I can tell, both procedures that are currently used to produce literary maps are limited in their output as well as their explanatory power. If those two procedures could be more closely linked, new possibilities will undoubtedly open up. But for a variety of reasons, this is easier said than done. That's sort of an understatement. But this is sort of an endorsement, and I have to confess, this I found after we started working on the project, but it's certainly an endorsement of the direction we're going, saying, on the one hand, you have a hermeneutic approach to text. On the other hand, you have something like distant reading. Gee, it would be nice if you could, to create literary maps, it'd be nice if those would be combined. And that's, in fact, exactly what we're trying to do with DreamScape. I'm going to take a minor digression to say that Dream, as it was a project with the early modern forms of conversion project, the SHRP partnership, Voyant. This interface is actually part of that, but in a sense, we've partnered with CRIHN, the Centre de Recherche Informatique de Montréal. And these are the people who have been more involved. There's actually, when we meet, there's sometimes a larger group than this, but I want to point out these people in particular. And one of those faces should be familiar, Jérôme Labonté, thanks for coming. And so, this was interesting. I want to step back and say, for Digital Humanities Project and for the way that we've been working, and the way that we work, the way that we've developed Voyant for many years is very amateurish in a lot of ways. It's sort of, when I have time, I'll sit down and do some coding on it, and because that's what I like doing. But it's not something that is sort of managed, that's planned in a professional kind of way. And that's the case for a lot of digital humanities projects. We're not trained to manage large projects, right? What was interesting to me was to tried to work with CRIHN in part because this thing that exists, you know, out there and in my head, if we were going to collaborate on it, it meant that I needed to change my practices, and I needed to make explicit, or I needed to put out there a certain number of things that happen in here. So that was one of the interests in working with the CRIHN. We happen to have, through the partnership grant, some funds that would allow for the development of a prototype. And Jérôme did a lot of the sort of background research and development for the interface. Other people in the project, like Caroline and Gabriel, were more interested in the named entity recognition of the TCP EBO collection, and also disambiguation, which are two separate steps, because you're trying to identify candidate locations, and then in some cases you need to disambiguate between London, Ontario, and London, England. And that's an easy example, relatively. So some of the work that was done, this isn't meant to, this probably isn't very legible, but they did some first experiments. This is using a Python package called Spacey, and you can see a certain number of things that come up. I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but one of the particularities that's of the collection, and this comes up a lot in humanities collection, is that the older the text, the more there's capitalization of words. And capitalization of words is one of the heuristics used by named entity recognizer to say, oh, this is a proper name, right? And so it doesn't work evenly. Obviously, it doesn't work as well in German as for English. And if it expects tobaccos, and every such tobacco, I don't know what that really means there, but you know, tobacco is probably a common noun here, but this is a text where for whatever reason it's capitalized. And Spacey is, it's actually trained on a linguistic model, but it's still making naive judgments about what certain places would be. CRIHN has actually developed an in-house solution that is much less messy in a variety of ways, but even here you see, so, you know, just to show one example among other, Scotland, the same lexical form is identified in two different ways depending on the structure. In fact, this is an error. It should be the same type of entity in this case, but it's not represented as this. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but part of the work that CRIHN did was to compare different packages, and for a variety, these are texts in Dream, in TCP EBO. And one of the things that you can see is that the number for spacies are usually much higher than CRIHN. This says how many entities, how many locations are being found by Spacey and how many are being found by CRIHN. So this looks good because it seems to be finding more, but if you look at the results, it's because Spacey is overfitting. It's finding more it has a lot of false positives that aren't that useful. So in fact, if you look at the accuracy that can be measured by recall, CRIHN is actually doing much better. Spacey's not doing great in terms of in terms of accuracy. In fact, they went beyond this more recently to train another model, and that's what's being used for the current interface. Some examples of challenges, and there are a lot of them, but just to give you an idea, what is a location? So if you have something like Kingdom of Antichrist, this is sort of something that you might find. Well, I was going to say in fiction, you might find it as well elsewhere as well. A Scot, if you're talking about a person, is this a location that you want to flag? In the idea that you're wanting to see how things move in a text, is it important to identify people by their location as being tied to their location? Well, the answer is that there's not an answer, probably. It depends. There's, of course, all the co-referential challenges that come up, things like this city that may be clear in context, or it may be that the city is never actually named. It's just the city. In other cases, you have formulations like Duke of Albany, where Albany is a location, but in this case, it's a person, right? So I mean, this isn't the most difficult thing to resolve. You can say, okay, take the largest chunk, Duke of Albany, that's a person. But maybe the provenance of that person, again, like a Scot, is actually something useful to track. And in other cases, there may be locations that we sort of can recognize, but where the collection has been normalized for orthography. Another thing, of course, is the 15th, 16th century, 17th century texts, even into the 18th century, orthographic variation is enormous. And so we've done a certain amount of work to try and normalize that, which makes the work of the named entity recognizer easier. But there are still entities, locations that aren't found, although we can probably recognize what those might be. So there's work that's been done at the CRIHN around improving named entity recognition and disambiguation. Another set of tasks has been around, that Jérôme's been doing, is around identifying what platform, what tools to use for the interface. And so there are various possibilities. Here are three that were considered: Mapbox, Leaflet, OpenLayers. And you know, each of these has a certain number of characteristics, from load time to aesthetics. Actually, there are two things. There's the framework on the one hand, and then there's the base layer, so the actual maps that are used. CRIHN has some familiarity with OpenLayers. It seems to do everything that's needed, and so that was the one that was chosen for our prototype. Similarly, there's the base layer. So we're used to Google Maps. No one uses Bing, but I can assure you they also have maps. But there are also other things like ArcGIS, Carto for CartoDB, and there are different providers of maps. And again, these have different characteristics. Sometimes load time is faster. Sometimes the map contains data like city names on the map. Sometimes it's separated. Sometimes there are aesthetic considerations. We're working with a historical collection, so it doesn't really work to have a modern map of the City of London in our visualization, right? We wanted something that felt a little more flexible, and nuanced, and so on. And so we chose the Stamen, which is part of the not Open Maps, sort of OpenStreetMaps. Here are two examples of maps. These are actually, these are two of the finalists for consideration. So this is ArcGIS National Geographic map, which is okay. It's actually pretty good. And here we're obviously at a very high 30,000 feet or more. In fact, this is the one that we ended up using. Both of them sort of look like watercolor based, but this is the one that we wanted. There was the mix of characteristics that we wanted. In part, all the labels and the boundaries are separate information from the actual tiles that are the maps. And so it's far more flexible for constructing what we wanted to do. Here's an early prototype. Again, it's a screenshot, so it's not going to show very much. But one of the first prototypes that Jérôme came up with had this mechanism where it was reading back-end data. We had to have the idea of being able to filter different cities, different connections between cities, different journeys or travels, or animating that part of it. Although in the first version, for good reason, this was developed outside of Voyant, and so it was standalone. In what we developed later on, part of the work was in integrating the two. And so, if I may, I will try to do a demo, which is never a good idea when you want to do it live. Okay, so this, so one of the things, well, actually, I think if I hover over it, it stays there. So one of the first things that we wanted to do is say, hello, this is a tool that is very experimental. That, you know, this is our disclaimer to say, be careful with what you're seeing, because partly and this is so important for the kind of tools that we develop, this leads us to believe that something right is happening in the background. We want to sort of forefront for the user that probably there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of errors, and this may actually get, you know, we may change this message even more, but the idea is to signal that this is a work in progress. It so happens that this is loading, so this is actually using real data, but not data that is produced by CRIHN's named entity recognition and disambiguation. It's used in the Jane Austen corpus, which is a default corpus that's available in Voyant. And so you have, you know, it's generating real names. One of the things that you can tell right away is that there's a surprising number of connections with North America. For Jane Austen, this would be surprising indeed, right? And so it doesn't take long to sort of start to look at what's happening to see that some of these locations, so Dixon, you know, I'll show another interface in a moment where we can drill down and look more closely. But there are two things that are somewhat suspicious here. One is that Dixon refers to somewhere in California, and in Jane Austen that probably isn't the case. And the second is that there is a connection with a place called Most, which is a real place, but probably not a place in the context of the text, right? So I want to emphasize that in this first prototype, we were thinking more about the functioning of the interface than the validity of the underlying data. That will improve as our named entity recognition and disambiguation improves. But the idea basically is that you can look at the various connections that there are, and you can look at, and what's happening here is that the text is being read start to finish with each of those sequences. So these are conceptual journeys by virtue of two locations being mentioned, and below here, we have the idea that you can read the text, and so you get things like Lady Claremont, who's a person, not a location, but it's being flagged as a location because there is a city called Claremont. This interface, so I'm going to do a certain number of things. I'm going to try and, so I can. And I'm just realizing that for some reason in Safari, the cities aren't being shown, so we'll have to look at why that is. So one of the interesting things in terms of development is that Jérôme's first instinct, which was completely justified and understandable, was to show less data, was to show at this level, not 100 cities, but say 10 or 20 of the most prevalent cities, right? And if you zoomed in, then you start to see more and more detail. And that makes complete sense in a variety of ways, but in the context of creating an interface that's meant for large-scale, broad exploration, sometimes hiding things behind, you know, further steps isn't what you want. So this is much more dense as information, and we've used various techniques like the opacity of the arrows not to make this overwhelming. But it shows much more information, but it also shows, you know, you can see that there's essentially like a heat map here because, not surprisingly, in Jane Austen, a lot is happening in Great Britain. And I can zoom in and see some, I will, sorry, I'll stop the animation. And so, you know, you can see, for instance, London, not surprisingly, is a hub. This sort of looks like a plane flight map that you see in the seat pocket of the plane. London is a hub for various connections in the text, and you can go in and view more carefully any of them that you're interested in. You can also advance one by one for each of the connections. You can do it step by step if you're interested. Part of the interface is to provide a certain amount of control over cities, how many cities, a maximum number of cities that are shown. This you can increase. The population of the city. So by default, a city has to have 10,000 people before it's shown, which is also a useful way of avoiding more noise, because if you include all the cities that have 1,000 people, you get a lot more false positives. And you can increase this. So, you know, if I increase this from 10,000 to 100,000, I have fewer cities. If I increase it from 100,000 to 1 million, I have 3 or 4 cities that are left in these developed. But all of this is meant to be a highly interactive, real-time exploratory tool. Similarly, for connections, I can control the count. So how many times that journey it happens in the text, and sorry, the number of connections that are shown, and also the minimum number of occurrences of that connection. So how many times the sequence went from place A to place B. And then for animations, if I wanted to do something like crazy, like restart the animation. Oop. Oh, it's because I have, okay, there we go. So if I want to get dizzy, I can sort of see all the journeys that are happening. I can read a book in no time flat. Isn't that great? The other component that was, again, a great suggestion that Jérôme made was to allow us to create multiple filters. So I have Jane Austen. If I want Emma to be one of the filters, now what I have is all of the connections in Emma, the text. If I add a filter, I can compare Emma to so these are either by dates, or Michael will know better what these correspond to in terms of. I would have thought, what's the Northanger Abbey? Okay. So, so now, you know, here I'm comparing between 2 different texts in the collection, but these are filters. So they could be text, they could be date ranges, they could be genres, they could be various kinds of things that I might want to compare. And to have that overlaid in a way, you know, if there's one. If you're adding green and there's not much green compared to blue, you know that if they're comparable, blue has a lot more journeys, whatever that means, right? So if I load Shakespeare and I load all the comedies and tragedies as separate filters, is there more travel happening in comedies than, actually probably more in tragedies than in comedies, okay? Okay. So I'm almost done. Another thing I wanted to point out is that something that is part of the work that we're doing with the data walls is it's not just working at very high resolution, large density, large collections. It's about sort of scaling and navigating between scales. Any robust digital research methodology must allow the scholar to move easily between distant and close reading, between the bird's eye view and the ground level of the text themselves, right? This is why Google Ngrams tends to be very frustrating for humanities scholars, because you can see a trend, but you can't go read the text. You can't see why. You can't start looking more closely, which you should always be skeptical of, because who knows how clean the underlying data is. So here's an example of the same interface, but because this is a Voyant tool that's fully integrated, I can start to do interesting things like, I had a good example lined up. Well, it doesn't matter. Anyway, so let's say that I click on, oh, right, I don't have the cities in this view. Okay, so let's say I click on Compton. So what's happened is I've clicked on Compton in DreamScape. This is Jane Austen. I can assure you that Compton isn't in LA, regardless of what the system may think. Compton's been chosen because it has a higher population than the other Compton, or the other Comptons. But what I can do is I can click on it to get in another tool the overall trend for that term in the document. So it happens that it happens in this document. In Mansfield Park, I can load the text. I can load the text to see that I wish you could see Compton. So, in this case, I can drill down to the level of the text in order to better understand, if I have a right location or not. And part of the work that we want to do next is to allow the user to edit and fix some of the things. We want to improve the NER first so that the user has to do that as little as possible. But if the user goes through the process of reading individual occurrences, you want to give them the opportunity to fix it. They realize it's wrong. You don't want that intellectual effort to evaporate. You want to be able to record that so that future people can make use of it, or that reading of it can be accessible. Maybe two people disagree on the importance or the location of Compton. Maybe that's interpretive, and you want those to coexist in conflict. We should be able to do that by allowing the user to edit the collection. So as I mentioned, this is the slide from 2 years ago with our aspirations for what to do and the 3 things. And much to my surprise, because it wasn't this conscious, we sort of fulfilled it. So I decided that I'm going to do this from now on and have more aspirations, like landing a $10 million grant, like curing all the evils of the world, and like actually collaborating with literary scholars. Thank you.
Questions, comments, vote?
I do have one right away, which is pushing us up in the abstract, if you will. But I just came across last week an article by the philosopher of science, Ram Hari. I don't know if you've met that. And he wrote that back in the 90s. And he was doing a general critique of the way in which in the humanities and social sciences we construct space-time, accusing all of us of being overly Newtonian and thinking that everything is homogeneous time and Euclidean space, and engaging us in organizing space-time of humanities and social sciences on different parameters, such as, for example, even though you may want to use a datation, actions taking place at certain times, and the kinds of also space you want to deal with can inflate or shrink depending on the kinds of events you're looking at in your study. I was wondering, therefore, listening to you, if you take Harry's critique seriously, does it mean it undermines your visualization, let's say prejudices or commitments, which are natural enough,
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the real tricky part is that I can be here and say, be very careful with what you think you're seeing, right? And so I'm forefronting the messiness of it. The problem is that this is a tool that gets out there, and where that, you know, there's no sort of, there's not necessarily some, which we have that little box, but it's not actually a full disclaimer about the nature of knowledge in literary criticism and the humanities and so on. And you know, I completely agree with that. And yet, and we should know better. But if we first start to use the tools that are available for us that have been developed for other purposes, right? So I was mentioning ArcGIS. That assumes that you have, you know, binary data that is you can quantify in ambiguous ways things so that you can then quantify them and map them onto something. And what I hear there is a call for us to redouble our efforts to create interfaces that challenge those you know, those presuppositions about the things that we're dealing with. And you know, the irony is that we know better. We know that, especially in literature and in fiction, that time and space are fluid notions, you know, in a variety of ways, even in the most sort of clear ways when it's in the text. It's also, you know, it's never real time in the sense that can be mapped over. So I see it as a challenge for us to make sure that our interfaces express those notions, which you know, echoes a bit sort of Joanna Drucker's work, for instance, on visualizations in the humanities that express uncertainty and so on. So one of the things that I didn't talk about is that CRIHN's tool allows for confidence levels to be expressed in the named entity recognition and disambiguation, right? And so in the interface in the prototype that I showed, all cities are sort of shown the same. But if you showed a half circle for a city where you're kind of half sure that it's actually a city, that's starting to forefront some of the uncertainty and so on. Another aspect is, you know, the idea that that's implicit here, of even just using a map like this, right, which is in all kinds of ways very colonial. You know, we know a lot of things about the assumptions in this map. We know that Canada looks a lot bigger than it is. I mean, it's big, but it looks a lot bigger than it is because of projection, you know, because you take a globe and you project it. And so one of the things that we'd like to do is to make some of that functionality available. If you want to change the projection algorithm or methodology, you can do that. If you want to, I'm not sure this will work, but if you want to, no. There was a way to sort of rotate the map. So if you want to make, you know, Canada in the South Pole or notional South Pole, you can do that. So all that to say that it's something that I think we need to keep reminding ourselves of. In other ways, I would hate that to be paralyzing to development of new tools, because we're always going to make tools that simplify and reduce things. But it's a call to remember to try and express the complexity of the data and the uncertainty and the variability, not, you know, in whatever perspective, from whatever reader's point of view and so on. So I take that as a challenge more than an absolute critique of a tool like that. Yeah, no, but yeah.
Parfait. C'est super. Et je me demandais, vous avez utilisé un des axes de visualisation, c'est l'axe diachronique, lié à l'ordre du texte. Est-ce que vous aviez envisagé de le faire varier pour obtenir des choses un petit peu comme des concurrences lexicales sur les lieux et d'autres types de visualisation en fait, dans d'autres dimensions?
Oui, alors, je ne sais pas si je réponds tout à fait à la question, mais en fait, une des choses que je n'ai pas mentionnées le prototype que Jérôme avait développé au début, quand on voyait moins de données, quand on était plus loin, une des choses qu'il avait proposé, c'était de retenir, quand il y avait un voyage entre A, B et C, mais qu'on était assez loin, on pouvait passer directement de A à C. Je l'explique mal, mais c'est de pouvoir être flexible pour, justement, pour la séquence des lieux. Donc, l'interface en tant que telle n'était pas conçue pour analyser la co-occurrence, la fréquence au-delà de 2 lieux de suite. Mais puisque Voyant a de la fonctionnalité justement pour étudier les phrases, quand c'est des termes qui se suivent, il n'y a pas de raison pour qu'ils ne puissent pas analyser les concurrences de lieux comme phrases, la séquence comme un gramme, comme je disais.
Mais vous les présentez sur une carte par proximité. C'est-à-dire, au lieu d'avoir la temporalité du texte,
ouais.
Peut-être imaginer d'autres dimensions que la lecture.
Oui, ben en fait, ça l'est d'une certaine façon parce que l'animation montre la lecture séquentielle, mais les flèches qui sont là, les arbres qui sont là, c'est l'ensemble des données. Donc, si je ne sais pas si... donc, il me dit qu'il y a 5 occurrences de Londres à Langford, qui est encore une fois pas le bon Langford. Donc, c'est un début de ça. Mais tu voulais dire autre chose?
Je pense aux cartes magnifiques, je pense à toutes ces dimensions-là.
On s'en reparle.
En fait, c'était peut-être en lien avec cette question qu'en fait, il y a la temporalité du livre, de dire on commence au début du livre et on s'en va vers la fin. Mais en général, je ne sais pas à quel point c'est difficile, mais il y a quand même des marqueurs dans le texte où il y a des changements de temporalité, où on sait très bien que cette partie-là, ça s'en va avant. Donc, est-ce que c'est possible, vu que de toute façon, vous faites le repérage de lieux, d'essayer aussi de faire un repérage de la temporalité au sein du texte? Parce que si à un moment, elle dit quand on était enfant, on s'en allait là, c'est avant, dans l'expérience de l'histoire.
Ouais.
C'est peut-être ça qu'on disait dans une autre temporalité.
Oui, ok, je comprends. Ouais. Alors, la réponse un peu bête, c'est que difficile fois difficile égale infiniment difficile. Et justement, si on arrive à peine à pouvoir identifier les lieux dans le texte, de penser que par la suite, on pourrait faire de façon assez automatisée l'identification des temps dans le texte. C'est au-delà de, je pense, ce qu'on a envisagé pour l'instant. Qui sait, peut-être que tout le buzz autour de l'intelligence artificielle pourra nous aider, mais pour l'instant, en fait, c'est un aspect qui m'intéresserait beaucoup, mais on ne s'était pas mis comme objectif au départ d'ajouter ça, en partie en reconnaissant que il y a la linéarité de la lecture est très limitée, mais aussi très commune. C'est comme ça qu'on lit, n'est-ce pas? Et donc, même s'il y a un renvoi vers le passé, il reste que le lecteur lit dans cet ordre et qu'il y a une séquence qui est assez fixe pour ça. C'est sûr qu'on peut sauter en lisant, mais au-delà de l'hypertextualité, il y a très peu de nous qui le faisons en lisant, au moins pour la première fois, un texte. Alors oui, c'est autant de directions qui seraient tout à fait fascinantes et désirables à poursuivre, mais peut-être dans une version 2.0 ou 9.0 ou plus tard.
Moi, peut-être justement, en pensant à ça, mais est-ce que la possibilité d'avoir un corpus bien préparé, plus limité, donc de ne pas faire l'automatisation, d'essayer d'utiliser des outils qui prennent ça, mais de prendre l'édition d'OUP en TEI des nouvelles, et là, regardez si vous pourriez faire comme alternative pour peut-être encourager les gens à Si tu prépares bien ton corpus, on va pouvoir faire tout ça. S'il est brouillon, bah, on va avoir plein de dates, plein de notations un peu partout.
Oui, tout à fait. Alors, un des défis, c'est que le voyant se veut disponible à toutes les langues, à tous les textes, etc. Donc, on voulait quelque chose qui fonctionnerait, tant bien que mal, pour n'importe qui voudrait amener ses textes, que ce soit en coréen, en anglais ou autre. L'idée du travail avec le CRIHN, c'était justement de faire une reconnaissance d'identité beaucoup plus fiable de IBO et de mettre en place un mécanisme où on pourrait ajouter ça et se servir de ça s'il est là, mais de revenir à un modèle moins fiable si les données ne sont pas là. On n'a pas tout à fait imaginé toute la pipeline pour voir comment l'utilisateur pourrait ajouter d'autres données ou dans quel format, etc. On a le format qui conviendra pour IBO, mais il faudra penser plus généralement à comment les gens pourraient s'en servir.
Peut-être plus dans un registre d'historien que de critique littéraire ou théoricien de la littérature. Il y a un champ qui me semblerait drôlement servi par ce genre d'outil. C'est tout le domaine des histoires, des idées, histoire de la philosophie, histoire de la littérature, histoire des sciences, histoire de la musique. Tout ça. Et il y a un problème qui revient constamment, qu'on voit quelquefois effleurer dans des livres un peu particuliers qui, par exemple, prennent en charge l'histoire d'une ville pendant quelques dizaines d'années. Et là, tout à coup, on se rend compte qu'il y a plein de monde en même temps dans la ville, et donc des possibilités de rencontres, on peut aller fouiller et chercher. Si on pouvait, par exemple, prendre un corpus aussi développé que possible de biographie et commencer à organiser la présence des gens dans des villes spécifiques à des moments précis du calendrier, on pourrait très rapidement dire qu'il y a une probabilité de temps que les gens suivants étaient en même temps dans une ville qui avait peut-être 20 000 habitants, 30 000 habitants à l'époque. Il ne faut pas oublier que Paris, Londres et Rome n'étaient pas des très très grosses villes du XVIIe siècle. Et en plus, si on joue les couches sociales et les filtres, tout ça, la probabilité des rencontres devient extraordinairement élevée à ce moment-là. J'ai l'impression que ceci soulèverait des quantités de questions, de possibilités de découverte, de rapports qui ont été complètement négligés, simplement parce que les données sont très très difficiles à récupérer actuellement. Et là, une lecture lointaine des biographies permettrait de donner ce genre de résultats. Est-ce que vous travaillez un peu sur ce genre de choses?
Oui, ben, en fait, c'est aussi dire et répéter que il nous faut, en tant que chercheurs dans les humanités, beaucoup plus de bonnes données avec ce genre d'informations qui ouvrirait toutes sortes de possibilités. Une des inspirations pour cet outil, pour l'interface, c'était Mapping the Republic of Letters. C'était un projet de Stanford, où ce n'est pas des biographies, mais des lettres. Mais il y a un rapport là, évidemment, où on sait, c'est aussi la circulation des idées, la co-occurrence des gens, etc. Et donc, c'est absolument dans cette direction que je nous voyais travailler. Pas forcément pour la biographie, mais par exemple, je pourrais imaginer de travailler. Je ne sais pas si ça marcherait. J'allais dire, si on prenait des entrées de Wikipédia ou de Dbpedia avec des personnes, des gens, ça pourrait être intéressant. Une autre collection, on travaille déjà avec le projet Orlando, qui est les biographies des écrivaines britanniques. Et donc, ça, c'est très, très riche pour les métadonnées, j'imagine.
Ça, c'est un projet ouvert.
Ouais.
C'est un peu comme Wikipédia. Ouais. C'est le genre de choses qui devraient être offertes au monde. Et les gens enrichissent, purifient, nettoient, ajoutent, etc. C'est pas un genre de choses qu'un groupe devrait prendre de façon fermée, mais plutôt devrait créer comme une graine qui va se pousser dans toutes les directions.
Ouais.
Ça serait la vision.
Malheureusement, Orlando est en fait fermé pour des raisons de financement. C'est Cambridge, donc
oui,
pas accès aux données, mais
ça c'est un non-sens, bien sûr.
L'outil que vous avez développé est spécifique linguistique. Du coup, ça veut dire qu'il est spécifique à une langue?
Non, bon, dans la version naïve, je dirais, il y a une ressource qui s'appelle GeoNames et qui a le nom des villes du monde dans plusieurs langues. Et donc, ce qu'il fait, c'est qu'il se sert de ce qui a été détecté comme langue pour les textes et il se sert de ça pour essayer de détecter les noms de lieux. Donc, je disais le coréen. Si on a un texte en coréen, il va aller chercher les versions coréennes des noms de villes et il va essayer de trouver des connexions.
On peut connecter à son propre
référentiel. Alors, c'est cet aspect-là qui n'est pas tout à fait développé encore. OK. Oui, non, avec plaisir. C'est le troisième.
Moi, il est annoté pour les deux.
Parfait. Oui, puis en fait, je devrais dire aussi au nom du crime que, pas au nom du crime, mais une des sources de frustration, c'est qu'on n'a pas vraiment de... Ibo n'a pas été traité de façon fiable et donc on n'a pas le moyen de tester combien bonnes sont les données du processus. Alors que si on a un gold standard, je ne sais pas comment on dit en français.
Avec le connaissant, oui, ça va très bien.
Plus doré que ce qu'on a.
Oui.
Je voulais revenir, je ne sais pas vraiment quel est le lien exact entre Voyant Tool et votre outil, mais ce que j'aimais beaucoup dans Voyant Tool, la version que je connais, je sais pas, c'est l'espèce de niveau d'abstraction qu'on prend où on ressort des mots, etc. Et que là, le travail que vous faites avec l'espace, je trouve vraiment très intéressant, mais vous alliez seulement cet espace à l'espace physique réel, alors que l'espace dans un roman peut aussi se situer autrement. Quand je pense, par exemple, à faire dans un roman, quels lieux vont être mentionnés à proximité, donc quels sont finalement les lieux les plus importants du roman, etc. J'ai l'impression que ce ne serait pas un si gros travail par rapport à ce que je mentionnais tout à l'heure, de faire ce passage-là avec les choses que vous identifiez. Oui, on peut les mettre sur une carte, mais on pourrait aussi faire les autres visualisations que vous avez dans Voyant, et qui pourraient vraiment renseigner sur d'autres natures de relations d'espace, en fait, qui ne sont pas forcément physiques.
Oui. Oui, en fait, je pensais que vous alliez proposer, suggérer des façons de visualiser des lieux fictifs, et ça, j'aimerais beaucoup entendre, parce que je n'ai pas vraiment d'idée là-dessus. Mais c'est vrai que les mots ont cette double fonction tiennent pour des lieux, mais aussi opèrent comme des formes lexicales dans le texte qui peuvent être utilisées avec les autres outils. Donc, si j'ai Londres, je ne l'ai pas montré dans l'exemple, mais je peux montrer toutes les concurrences de termes à Londres aussi pour essayer de mieux comprendre comment Londres comme lieu fonctionne. Jusqu'à un certain point, c'est possible de le faire aussi avec des phrases. Donc, si on a une phrase, on peut voir pour chaque occurrence de cette phrase, quels sont les termes qui se situent tout près. On pourrait imaginer qu'une phrase est constituée par deux lieux, et donc on voudrait savoir quelle est la constellation des termes qui sont là quand on a ces deux lieux.
Et si tu veux, je pense que ce que veut dire Léna, c'est un peu l'idée que je voulais tenter quand je parlais de carte amorphique. Il y a un espace imaginaire dans le texte, et ça, on peut peut-être le représenter soit en déformant la carte, soit en faisant une visualisation de cet espace-là. Et c'est pour ça que Léna disait, autrement que l'espace topographique, comment représenter cet espace, cette dimension des lieux visuellement.
Ouais.
C'est ce que vous faites avec les concurrences, en réalité.
Oui, c'est pourquoi ça devient du graphe.
Non, parce que ça peut être une carte déformée où les coordonnées géographiques sont altérées par la proximité des termes. Et là, tu déformes. Ça, c'est classique, c'est les visualisations graphiques. Et là, on a des espaces qui varient en fonction du texte.
Ouais. Oui, ça c'est sûr que ça m'intéresse beaucoup. Ça,
et les lieux imaginaires là-dedans.
Oui. Et c'est vrai que il n'y a rien qui nous empêcherait d'utiliser une carte notre propre image comme carte pour suggérer un espace imaginaire, mais représenté de façon cartographique. Mais il faudrait le produire. Ce serait un projet pour une certaine collection qui aurait forcément à inclure l'expertise du chercheur.
Je ne suis pas sûr. Je sais que l'encyclopédie de Stanford fait l'objet d'une expérimentation de ce type-là. Elle était représentée comme des îlots de connaissances en fonction justement de l'analyse automatisée des concepts et des notions.
Ouais.
Donc, c'est Ganassia qui a fait ça, je crois.
Oui. Non, il y aurait sûrement des choses et peut-être il faudrait collaborer avec... il faudrait sûrement collaborer avec d'autres gens pour ça. Et je dis qu'on pourrait utiliser des cartes, mais on peut créer les cartes aussi de façon algorithmique qui serait intéressant.
Il y a plusieurs problèmes, là, je crois, qu'on peut distinguer. Il y a par exemple le problème général de ce qu'on pourrait appeler la géographie mentale, imaginaire de chacun d'entre nous, dans notre façon de représenter le monde. Et ça va varier avec les gens, les périodes, les états psychiques, et ainsi de suite. Il y a je dirais, la représentation plus objective d'un espace, d'un territoire qui se construit en fonction des moyens de communication qui demandent plus ou moins de temps. Et ça peut se représenter verbalement, textuellement, dans des romans, mais aussi dans des descriptions de géographie, de voyageurs, et ainsi de suite. Là encore, ça pourrait donner lieu au deuxième ordre de choses. Il y a une troisième chose qui est beaucoup plus complexe, mais en même temps plus drôle, tu y as fait allusion, je crois, tout à l'heure, c'est tenter de cartographier des lieux imaginaires. Imaginez, par exemple, de prendre l'œuvre de Faulkner et de cartographier Yakina Patatra et donc d'arriver là à voir si, par exemple, dans les représentations que Faulkner introduit dans ces divers romans, qu'il place toujours dans ce même comté, est-ce qu'il crée une géographie cohérente du monde? Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire? Il y a énormément de projets derrière ça, parce que, bon, par exemple, lorsque on est au XVIIIe siècle, qu'on se situe en France, aller de Paris à Marseille, alors que les routes royales commençaient vraiment à se mettre en place, ça prenait quand même 15 jours. On dit de nos jours que aller en France, c'est un pays qui, à cause des avions, a une dimension, en gros, 1 heure, 1 heure et quart. C'est ce que ça prend en avion pour aller d'un point à un autre dans le pays. Donc, on est dans des représentations et dans des modes psychiques ou psychologiques d'accessibilité au reste d'un territoire qui devient très variable selon les points de vue, les perspectives adoptées. Tout ça pourrait être représenté d'une certaine manière.
Tu as tout noté, Jérôme? Pour la semaine prochaine, on aura ça?
Non, mais je balance des,
oui.
je balance des pistes. Hein, c'est bien à l'esprit comme ça.
Ce que je souhaiterais honnêtement avant tout, c'est que le prototype qu'on développe frustre assez pour stimuler des idées.
J'ai toujours envie de développer avec toi.
Ce qui serait aussi intéressant, c'est de faire la chose inverse, partir d'une ville et voir la géographie d'une ville, d'un endroit dans la littérature.
Oui.
Et donc construire
un territoire littéraire.
Un territoire littéraire, évidemment. Genre prendre la ville de Paris et voir comment la ville de Paris a été représentée, imaginée par les peintres, les poètes, les littéraires, les marchands, etc., au fur et à mesure de l'histoire, et avoir accès de telle manière, non seulement à une dimension imaginaire, mais aussi à l'imaginaire de la ville.
Exactement.
L'imaginaire d'un lieu, d'un endroit, etc., pour voir comment ça a changé au fur et à mesure pendant les siècles.
Oui. Et ce que je trouve intéressant, c'est de se heurter constamment au vocabulaire visuel qu'on a pour interpréter les cartes ou interpréter les visualisations. C'est-à-dire que je pourrais imaginer beaucoup plus de dimensions qu'on voudrait représenter, mais qui ne seraient pas assez intuitives, si je peux dire, pour que ça vaille la peine, à moins de lire un manuel d'utilisation qu'on sait que très peu de gens vont faire. Et donc, c'est cette négociation constante entre ce qui ce que les gens vont reconnaître et ce qu'on voudrait représenter.
La chronologie, l'ordre de lecture du guide pas beaucoup, ne fonctionne pas très bien comme point d'entrée parce que le guide est organisé par rubrique. Alors évidemment, il y a des logiques de quartier et il y a potentiellement des parcours à réaliser à l'intérieur du guide. Mais plus fondamentalement, c'est l'image que donne à lire un guide par rapport à un autre qui est fondamentalement intéressante. C'est des questions de densité, de lieu. C'est pour ça que je trouve intéressant d'essayer de varier l'axe temporel avec de remplacer par d'autres dimensions.
Pour le côté pratique par rapport aux corrections, est-ce que vous envisagez de faire un peu comme Laura dans son truc de correction de l'OCR, qui est une petite fenêtre à rajouter et dire comme John n'est pas là et que ton texte à toi disponible surveillant par défaut, au moins pour commencer par des textes qui ne comptent pas celle de s'améliore avec le temps rapidement, ou est-ce que là tu vois quelqu'un qui t'envoie un courriel ou un tweet à part? Comment est-ce que tu verrais la capacité de dire flag le fait que c'est pas le bon truc et toi tu l'ingères et tu le modifies?
Ouais. Mais le problème là encore, c'est que il y a bien des décisions qui seraient sujettes à la discussion. Et donc, on ne voudrait pas que quelqu'un impose sa lecture sur tous les autres. Il y a des corrections qui sont clairement des corrections, mais ce que je verrais plus, c'est qu'il y aurait des couches de correction qui viendraient s'ajouter constamment pour que la personne puisse même comparer les lectures, les corrections.
Moi, je pensais aussi, si c'est à l'optique justement de là où tu as 12 personnes qui interviennent et 10 disent c'est pas le bon Crampton, tu pourrais élaguer un petit peu ton travail à toi pour ce processus de crowdsourcing où tu vas dire que s'il y en a ceux qui en ont 10 sur 12 qui ont pris le temps de te donner la correction, ça va être un bon signe et essayer de voir comment tu utiliser ça pour certains corpus. Questions, commentaires, on arrive à la fin de notre période dans la salle. Allez tous jouer à la maison, faites sauter le serveur, les voyants. Encore merci Stéphane pour ton intervention.
Merci à vous.
Et dans 3 semaines, Darren Wessler de Concordia va nous parler du Media Archaeology Lab, vendredi 13h dans les activités du CRIHN. Et 3 semaines plus tard, Martha Boni du département de littérature va nous parler de cartographie des séries télé et elle ne connaît pas l'existence de DreamScape, donc on va falloir qu'elle réécrive sa conférence. Merci à tous d'être venus.
On a trouvé la méthode de la il y a 223 parties sur la carte.